This election is more than just a choice between two parties and two different candidates. It is a choice about whether we have a country rooted in freedom for every American or ruled by chaos and division.
This election is a choice between whether we will have 4 more years of gross incompetence and failure, the worst administration in the history of our country, or whether we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country. We're going to turn it around, and we're going to turn it around fast.
An estimated 75,000 people were there last night at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. as Kamala Harris delivered what's been billed as her closing argument. With the White House as a backdrop, Harris framed the election as a choice between turning the page to a new generation of leadership and a return to the divisiveness of former President Trump. Meantime, in the critical swing state of Pennsylvania, Trump held a rally in Allentown last night, painting Harris as a continuation of what he says are the failed policies of the Biden administration. Joining me to discuss this dramatic night in the presidential race and much more, the Hill White House columnist Niall Stanage. Niall, you have a column out about some takeaways from the Harris rally in D.C. Her campaign says 75,000 people. I'm not going to weigh into the exact number. That's been controversial over the last few years, but no doubt a massive crowd. How do you gauge the effectiveness of that so-called closing argument?
I think she did give an effective closing argument. I think she wove quite a few strands together in the speech. There were some personal notes in the speech. Obviously, January the 6th came up, as everyone knew it would, in a speech from the Ellipse. But she was also making a broader argument. For example, trying to suggest that for voters just exhausted by former President Trump, she was obviously the choice that she believed they should make. And also really trying to suggest that she had the interests and the troubles of regular voters at heart, whereas she was casting Trump as an inherently selfish figure.
There's been a lot of talk of whether her final message is like more about saving democracy, which maybe appeals more to the Democratic base, or if she's going to try to make the case for an economic argument that maybe is the biggest issue for voters more broadly. In the speech last night, do you think she was able to kind of touch on both of those aspects in a way that will make her palatable to voters?
Yeah, I think she was. I mean, as I say, because it was at the Ellipse, she was always going to raise January the 6th and make that part of a broader argument about dangers to democracy. But she did go into the economy in terms of her own plans, talking about this admittedly controversial plan she has to crack down on price gouging with groceries and so forth. So I think she is trying to keep both of those themes going because they appeal in a slightly different way. I think the democracy argument is really about getting people who don't like Trump or do like Harris to make sure they come out and vote, really raise the stakes for them. The economy argument is somewhat different, I think, aimed at more voters in the center ground.
What about her efforts to differentiate herself from President Biden and the Biden administration? She's kind of struggled with that in the past since she took over the ticket. How do you think she did with that last night?
So she phrased it in a slightly different way than previously last night. She talked about the challenges that faced President Biden in 2020, predominantly the COVID-19 pandemic, and the challenges that we are facing now as a nation, predominantly inflation and the economy. And so she said that the challenges are different now than they were 4 years ago, and so she would be a different kind of president. That was reasonably effective framing. It's still a very difficult needle she has to thread as the sitting vice president.
Let's talk about Trump. He was in Pennsylvania, also made some media appearances, been playing a little bit of damage control after this rally at Madison Square Garden over the weekend. There were some jokes about Puerto Rico that offended some Latino voters. He was in Allentown in Pennsylvania, has a large Latino population. He also spoke on the Hannity show on Fox News where he said, "I can't imagine, it's a big deal." What do you make of the Trump rally in Pennsylvania and his efforts, whatever they may be, to respond after these remarks have offended some people?
So a couple of things. The Allentown rally, of course, was scheduled for several days, but it is notable that Allentown not only has a significant Latino population, but specifically a very significant Puerto Rican population. It's about the 8th biggest Puerto Rican community in the United States. So it was interesting that he had to go there after that rally in Madison Square Garden that I think did cause real offense to a lot of people. It could be important because of the Puerto Rican population in Pennsylvania and to a lesser extent in the other swing states. But there are other controversies, of course, now supplanting it. And I think the Trump campaign will be pretty glad for that.
And he didn't really address it directly in that speech, had kind of other people speaking to that. Do you think that's ineffective? That's very kind of Trump way of going about things. He's very reluctant to, quote unquote, apologize for things. How do you gauge how they're handling the issue?
Yeah, I think he probably felt that an apology would have fueled the story, given the story legs, as we say. So I think they believe that there's a chance now to really turn the page on this controversy. Whether there is or not, we've seen a lot of Puerto Rican celebrities, for example, come out and either explicitly endorse Harris or express disgust over that rally and the joke that caused all the furor. So Trump is just hoping to get past it, essentially.
Immigration is another issue that is important, not just to the Latino community, but more broadly. I want to play a soundbite from that Madison Square Garden rally where Trump is speaking to the issue of immigration.
The day I take the oath of office, the migration and this horrible migrant invasion ends, and the restoration of our country begins, and it begins in a very strong way.
You just want to correct that soundbite is actually from Pennsylvania. But on the issue of kind of the closing argument for the Trump campaign and the rhetoric, it seems like he's kind of oscillating from this dark imagery that he's painting as kind of like the current state of America, but also trying to incorporate something that maybe they learned from the Harris campaign of talking about the joy and the happiness that they want to celebrate and instill. What do you make of what is kind of the closing argument for the Trump campaign? You know,
I think immigration is one of his strongest issues, regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with his arguments on it. It's the issue that shows him with the largest advantage over Kamala Harris. So I think he's wanting to put as much emphasis on that as he possibly can. We see him hit that topic again and again at his rallies. And I think that, is it dark? Is it responding to a genuine fear that a lot of Americans have? I think it is something that he believes is going to be really important in his attempt to win the election. He argues at times in rallies that it is actually a more important topic than the economy.
Now, speaking of damage control, President Biden doing some of that. He was on a Zoom call with supporters, Latino voters, and he called Trump supporters garbage. He's came back to clarify that he was talking about the comedian from Madison Square Garden who made some disparaging remarks poking fun at Puerto Ricans. Harris said that she disagrees with criticism based on who people vote for. Republicans are likening this to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment from the 2016 race. How big of an impact do you think that comment will have?
I think it could have a significant impact for a couple of reasons. Like the Hillary Clinton deplorables comment, it feeds into this perception that Democrats are prone to be elitist or to sneer at Republicans and conservatives. Obviously, it distracts from what had otherwise been a very good night for Kamala Harris. If you were her or her campaign, you'd be furious about all of this. And then there's a third issue, which is the attempt to clarify, and I almost feel like putting the air quotes around clarify what he said. That seemed not terribly credible to me. Yes, at a real stretch, you could argue what he and the White House are saying, but if people see the clip for themselves, it does seem like he was calling the supporters garbage.
I want to talk about the economy as an issue is what voters say is the most important issue across the country. There's some new GDP numbers that are out, and I just want to read the top line from a New York Times story about those GDP numbers. Consumers are spending, inflation is cooling, and the U.S. economy looks as strong as ever. I know that the economy is seen through a partisan lens now, but that sounds like good news for Biden and, in turn, Harris.
Yes, you would think so. I mean, there has been good data on the economy for some time now. The problem is that for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be reflected really in public sentiment. President Biden, who you mentioned, has low approval numbers on the economy. Harris has struggled on the economy to be seen as a better candidate than Trump. So it is a curious and, for Democrats, frustrating mix here, where the numbers are objectively really very good, but people at large don't seem to be feeling that, perhaps because of the damage and hurt that was inflicted when inflation reached its peak, albeit 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now.
All right, Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Appreciate your time.
Good to be with you, Drew.
An election worker in Florida has been fired after filled out early voting ballots fell off a truck. Local election officials say the worker forgot to lock the back of a truck, causing a sealed bin and bag to fall out as the worker drove off. The Miami-Dade County Elections Department says the incident was due to human error and that the ballots were already scanned and tabulated at an early voting location. Election staff verified that no ballots were tampered with or damaged and all seals were intact. Staff also said the ballots were recounted and had their seals re-verified. The department maintains the employee was let go due to a zero-tolerance policy for errors. Billionaire Elon Musk has quickly become former President Trump's right-hand man on the campaign trail, pouring millions of dollars into his pro-Trump super PAC and offering $1 million a day to someone who signs his PAC's petition. But another notable billionaire has also hit the campaign trail on the other side of the aisle, Dallas Mavericks owner and businessman Mark Cuban. Cuban has become a key surrogate for the Harris campaign in the final stretch of the presidential election, at times sparring with Elon Musk over his involvement in the Trump campaign. Joining me now is the Hill staff writer Miranda Nazzaro, who recently talked with Mark Cuban and discussed his foray into politics. Now, Cuban has certainly jumped full force into the political arena. Do you have a sense of what's motivating him?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I spoke with Cuban yesterday, and one of the main things he talked about was just the closeness of this race and how it could just depend on a few hundred votes for these swing states. So for him, that was what he said drove him into helping more on the Harris campaign, and we saw him in Wisconsin, which one of the blue wall states, just a few weeks ago, and he said just solely Harris would make, quote, a better candidate and better president.
Let's talk about how the Harris campaign is utilizing him. I feel like I see him on every time I turn the TV on or I open up social media. He's doing a lot of podcasts. There's this notion that Harris is struggling with certain sectors of the male population, and I wonder if that's where they see him fitting in.
Sure. So yeah, Cuban is obviously a very well-known and very well-liked billionaire. So his favorability is, I think, plus 19 according to some Blueprint polling. And essentially, I think both the likability that he has as well as his appeal to not only corporate America, but to the tech world, to the sports world, the Dallas Mavericks, and to the medical world. And I think that the Harris campaign is trying to utilize Cuban to appeal to these audiences, which, as you mentioned, Harris has sometimes struggled to captivate, unlike Trump's camp, where he has more of an appeal with some male voters. So both male voters, young voters in general, Cuban is just generally a good surrogate to kind of be reaching these audiences that Harris has traditionally struggled to gain.
Cuban has had some criticism of the Biden administration, especially when it comes to the FTC chair, the SEC chair. He's criticized the Biden administration's policies regarding cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. Have there been discussions between Cuban and the Harris administration or people in her orbit that he might be able to have an influence on that if Harris wins?
Sure. So there's been a lot of speculation that Cuban would have some sort of influential role